Hello there and welcome to London History at Home's Cupboardlarking series. It's a bit like mudlarking, except we don't go to the Thames for various reasons. We root around amongst our family heirlooms instead. It's a bit like that History in 100 Objects series, except without access to the British Museum. So what we've got today is some needles. These are tiny, tiny, tiny crochet needles. They're very small. They're size, one of them is size 0, 0, one of them is size 1. So they're titty tiny. I did a bit of research and these date back to the early part of the 20th century. So they're about 100 years old. And the tiny needles like this were used for lace making or embroidery. Now, I don't actually remember being told what relative these are from. But in the early 20th century, my great-grandmother was an embroiderer working from home in the East End. So that got me to thinking about the textile history of the East End, which is considerable. So the East End has a good amount of textile history. This is Petticoat Lane in the 1940s. The textile history, we're going to talk about the more historic textile histories. But it has continued into the present day, largely by the Jewish and then Bangladeshi communities in the 20th century. So this is Petticoat Lane just after the Second World War. But in my great-grandmother's day, this is Petticoat Lane in the 1890s, when my great-grandmother would have been knocking about the East End. The textile industry was largely, there were factories around, but many women, particularly those with children, would have been working from home with the children joining in. This family are making dolls, but there were lots of other things that women would have done from home. Women would have been finishing shirts and trousers, trimming hats, embroidering like my great-grandmother, carding buttons, and other jobs as well, not related to the textile industry, like making sacks or stuffing mattresses, making matches. This woman and child are making matchboxes. So it could have been hard work. Many of these women would have had very little choice. The East End in the 19th century was a fairly poor area. Even those that weren't stricken with poverty would have been working class. It wouldn't have been a rich area. And women wouldn't have had access to childcare. Even if they did, they wouldn't have been able to afford it. So if you needed a bit of money, then what were you going to do? You had to work from home. So you worked from home and often involved the children as well, so you could get as much work done as possible. Some of these women would have got good wages from the factory owners, but the reason that factory owners farmed out work to home workers was so they could pay them less. Many women in the East End would have been surviving on sweating wages. That is, wages too low to even really cover their basic needs. Activists like Annie Besant found out about this and campaigned to stop these factory owners exploiting these women. Annie Besant is more famous for the Match Girls strike of 1888 and for improving conditions in factories for women, but she was also concerned with the plight of home working women as well, something that was almost invisible because of course these women were in their own home. So she tried, and indeed Annie Besant and other activists managed to get a minimum wage introduced in 1909, although women were again encouraged to do cheap labour from home during the two world wars. East End homes were particularly suited to the sort of close work, sewing and embroidering and lace making and things like that, and because of the big windows in the houses. So this is Wilk Street, fairly well-to-do houses even when they were built, the huge windows in them, not very far away from Wilk Street, Gascoigne Place, rather more working class homes, but again, huge windows. The East End homes tended to have big windows because of that textile tradition of the area. Many of these buildings were built following the Huguenot refugees coming into the area. The Huguenots were fleeing religious persecution in France and came to London in the late 1600s, bringing with them their skills for silk weaving. Not long after them, actually in the 1730s, Irish linen weavers emigrated to London. And again, many of them settled in the East End, where the Huguenots had before, and other parts of London as well, both the Huguenots and the Irish. But a lot of them came to the East End and built these fantastic houses with their huge windows so that they could set up their looms and be able to work with lots of light. Now, perhaps the reason that the East End was so attractive to the silk weavers and the Irish linen weavers was because it already had a tradition of weaving. The East End was already known for weaving, wool weaving and linen weaving. In fact, Daniel Defoe, the author, estimated that by 1670, which is just before the Huguenots arrived, there were about 40,000 silk ribbon weavers in London. And many of those would have been women working from home in the East End of London. It's thought that the phrase, the English phrase, on tenterhooks, comes from the Tenterground here in Spitalfields. So this is the Roke map of 1745 showing the area of Spitalfields in the East End, and there in the middle is the Tenterground. So a tenterground was where in other cities known, or other areas of cities known for their textile industry, you tend to get the same area, you tend to get the name reappearing, because a tenterground is where weavers and dyers would stretch out their fabric to dry rather, after it had been dyed, on tenter frames, huge hooked frames. So the tenterground is, it's been built over now, there's no open space there, but there have been big open spaces. And this tenterground is, so this is after the Huguenots and the Irish linen weavers arrived. But this map is long before. This is called the Copper Plate map of London from the 1550s, excuse me. And this is the area of Spitalfields. So down on the right there where the arches are, that's the Spitalfield. And just to the left of the arches, just near that main road, you can see a tenterground. That's the bolts of cloth there, pinned out to dry for the weavers of the area. So the East End had this weaving tradition for quite some time before the Huguenots and linen weavers, but they certainly made the East End a powerhouse of the textile industry. And in that sort of early Tudor, late medieval period is when Flemish artisans set up their dye works alongside the River Lee. So this is the River Lee, a bit north actually, but pretty, so we'll keep it. Flemish artisans set up their dye works along the river because they needed to get water for the dyeing, but they also needed to get rid of the nasty byproducts. So you need to be by a river. In 1643, this chap, Cornelius Drebbel, discovered a new kind of red dye, a new shade of red in the East End. He called it bow dye or bow red. He didn't actually produce it, but his daughter and her husband did in their factory in Bow, hence bow dye. They kept the family secret, and we don't really know particularly what colour it was, with colours tending to fade over time. But there continued to be colourworks and dye works in the East End up into the 20th century. This chap is William Perkin. William Perkin was a student. He was home on Cable Street in the East End for his Easter holidays. He was actually working on a cure for malaria, but accidentally discovered the colour mauve, the dye for mauve, and became more famous for that. So in the medieval period, England was the place to come for exquisite embroidery. If you wanted beautiful embroidery, you came to England. This is the late 13th century, the Clare chasuble, it's called. It's a priest's vestment, and it was made in a workshop in London. So London was known for its beautiful embroidery workshops, as many other cities in England were as well. So these embroidery workshops in London would have been, many of the embroiderers would have been women, not exclusively, but mostly. But the embroidery workshops did tend to be run by men. However, there were also embroidery workshops in convents. This is called the Scion Cope, so it's early 14th century. It was made in a convent in West London, actually, but there were convents in East London as well. There was Eastminster and the Minories right near the Tower of London, just outside the City of London. And there was St Mary's Spital, right in the area we're talking about, right in Spitalfields. So there would have been nuns, there would have almost certainly been nuns doing embroidery work in those convents in the East End. We just don't have any of it surviving, but this one's a lovely one, and I'm sure their work was just as good as the nuns in West London. Medieval London was also known for its silk weaving. So this is medieval London. The silk weaving centre was, there we go, that's Soper Lane in the City of London. Soper Lane was kind of the epicentre of the silk weaving industry in medieval London, and most of the silk weavers would have been women. They were known as silk women or silk wives. It was one of the industries that women could do on their own account. So even if they were married, it was their business. It was not owned by their husband. They could be femme sole. Very unusual in medieval London. So if you wanted to be an independent woman, you became a silk weaver, and you could train up apprentices, and they didn't have a guild, but they kind of formed their own gang in Soper Lane and looked after each other. And we know a lot of their names. They had good records, so we know a lot of the names of these silk women. I'll only do one of them. This is Alice Claver. So Alice Claver, I don't have a picture of her, but Alice Claver, we know, created some of the accessories, if you like, the silk trimmings and silk ribbons and sort of fripperies for the coronation of Richard III and his wife Anne Neville. And a few years later, the first Tudor monarch, Henry Tudor, and his wife Elizabeth of York also wore trimmings by silkwoman Alice Claver. So she was clearly a very successful silkwoman. So it's cheating a bit because Soper Lane is in the City of London. It's not in the East End. It's kind of the eastern end of the City of London. But the East End would have been fairly rural in the medieval period. So this is a map from 1543, which is early Tudor, really, but we'll consider it late medieval for the purposes of this point. So this is a map. We've got the Tower of London there, St Catherine's Dock. Up at the top there is Stepney. Over in the east is the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich. And by my rough approximation, the area of the East End around Spitalfields, where we've mostly been talking about, is about there. And there's not much there. Farms, villages, not much. So it would have been quite rural. There would have been people living there, but the women of the East End in the medieval period would have been doing a lot of jobs as women in rural communities did around the country. So they would have been looking after the children, looking after the home, looking after the small animals, the goats and the chickens. They would have been brewing beer. They would have been making cheese and baking bread. They would have been working as alewives. Maybe this is an alewife, another business that medieval women could do on their own account. But they would have been doing textile related jobs as well, mending clothes, making clothes. They would have been weaving wool and making linen thread, making both of those into cloth. So the East End tradition, I think we can legitimately say the East End textile tradition goes back all the way to the medieval period. So I just want to finish up by talking about a few particular East End textile workers. So Anna Maria Garthwaite was an 18th century East Ender who created these beautiful floral patterns on silk, on Spitalfield silk, from her home here on Princelet Street. That's her blue plaque for Anna Maria Garthwaite. Queen Victoria's wedding dress in 1840. She started the trend for white wedding dresses, actually, and the white silk that made up her dress was made of Spitalfields silk. So the women of the East End created Queen Victoria's wedding dress, had Honiton lace on it as well. Jessie Payne, that's Jessie Payne there, second from the left. Jessie Payne, more famous as a suffragette, but how she earned her crust, her bread and butter, was she had a home boot making business with her husband. They made boots at home. And she's not famous. She's important. She inspired me. This is Great Grandma Maria and the crochet needles there that she have ended up in my care. Great Grandma Maria, the embroiderer of the East End. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my little talk about East End history. Please like and follow the YouTube page if you'd like to see more, and find us on Facebook and Instagram, and have a good day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.